Imagine, if you will, an ancient towering monument. It's
Sure.
intricately carved, it's been standing for centuries. But who actually built it? And maybe more importantly, who does it truly belong to?
Yeah. And in Borneo, that's not just some abstract thought experiment, is it? It's right at the core of a really fascinating, sometimes quite heated debate about traditions like the Klirieng or Salong.
Exactly. It really forces you to look closely at how we understand cultural heritage, especially, when you have multiple groups living so close together, influencing each other over time.
It comes down to respecting where something started versus just acknowledging that, yeah, other people use it too.
Yeah.
Origins versus sharing.
Precisely. So today, that's what we're doing. A deep dive into the compelling and complex cultural history of these Klirieng and Salong traditions in Borneo. We'll be looking at some recent discussions, different viewpoints about where they came from.
And crucially, who can really lay claim to them.
Yeah. Our sources for this deep dive focus quite a bit on a particular perspective. One put forward by an individual named Azif. And his arguments, they raise some pretty fundamental questions.
They really do. Questions about cultural sharing, certainly, but also about this idea of appropriation and even what some might see as, well, misattributing heritage when we talk about the Klirieng.
So our mission here is to unpack all of that. We'll carefully examine the evidence, the historical stuff, the ethnographic records the sources provide.
And hopefully clarify what this means for understanding distinct cultural heritage, in a world that's just so interconnected now.
Okay, let's dig in.
Right. So Azif's position, it seems to reflect interpretations from some Sekapan elders in Balaga, basically suggests that cultural elements like the Klirieng are just equally shared, across multiple groups.
Which, on the surface, that sounds quite nice, doesn't it? Very inclusive, like this beautiful tapestry where everyone contributes a thread.
It does sound appealing. But is there a potential pitfall in that kind of broad stroke, especially when you're talking about indigenous cultures with very specific histories?
Yeah, that's the question.
Absolutely. The main counter-argument in the research we looked at is that this approach, Azif's approach, it kind of suffers from a basic conceptual problem.
Okay.
It basically conflates or mixes up cultural sharing with cultural origins.
Yeah.
And in anthropology, those are really two distinct ideas.
So they're not interchangeable at all. Could you maybe define those clearly for us?
Sure. So cultural sharing, that's about how practice is spread around. The diffusion, the adoption of things between groups. Maybe they live nearby, maybe they have alliances, trade, exchange.
Like borrowing a recipe from a neighbor?
Kinda, yeah. Or like a popular song getting covered by different bands. That's sharing.
Okay. And cultural origin?
Cultural origin is different. That's about where a practice first emerged. Its initial context, how it's really rooted in a specific community's way of life, their social structure, their cosmology, their whole worldview.
So who wrote the original song, and why?
Exactly. The inspiration behind it.
Got it. So when Azif talks about this rich tapestry of beliefs, rituals, and ancestral knowledge, and claims that asserting a specific origin somehow undermines the integrity of collective heritage, it sounds good, but the sources are saying that's maybe not true inclusivity.
That's the core of the counter-argument. The research suggests that genuine inclusivity actually means amplifying the voices of communities when they articulate their own traditions, respecting their specific life worlds, not sort of flattening them into one generic thing.
So understanding the specific threads actually makes the tapestry richer, not weaker.
Precisely. The sources argue that the rich tapestry isn't threatened by acknowledging specific origins. But what is potentially endangered is this older academic habit, maybe, of treating indigenous knowledge almost like interchangeable folklore.
Instead of seeing it as rigorous, specific, place-based knowledge systems.
Exactly. Intellectually coherent systems in their own right.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's zoom in on the Klirieng itself then. How widely known or practiced is this tradition, really, across Borneo?
Well, the research really emphasizes that the Klirieng tradition is neither widely recognized nor commonly practiced across the island as a whole. It's actually largely understudied, misunderstood even, beyond a pretty small number of indigenous communities.
And those communities are?
Chiefly those historically connected to the Punan people, and even more specifically, the Punan Ba group in Sarawak.
Okay. Now, this next bit of evidence the sources bring up is fascinating because, at first glance, it seems to support that equally shared idea. Experts have noted that, yes, other groups like the Sekapan and Kejaman also built Klirieng.
That's true, and it's an important point. Emeritus Professor Jerome Rousseau observed that, yeah. And there's a concrete example. The Kejaman Klirieng, built for Tipuong Tului. You can still see it today. It's in the Sarawak Museum.
So, case closed, shared tradition.
Well, hold on. Because when you dig into the history of that specific monument, the story gets, let's say, more nuanced.
Okay, tell me more.
The very first person actually interred in that particular Kejaman monument wasn't Kejaman.
Oh.
She was, and I'm quoting here, a woman of direct Punan descent, the daughter of Orang Kaya Saghieng, a Punan chief from Pandan.
Wow. And was this known?
Apparently so.
Yeah.
The research points out this crucial detail was openly acknowledged by Kejaman informants themselves back during fieldwork with the anthropologist Edmund Leach in 1957.
Huh. So acknowledged by the Kejaman themselves.
Yes. And interestingly, the sources also note that this particular monument, in its physical form, actually looks more like a salong, another related funerary structure, than what's considered a traditional Klirieng.
So even where other groups built these structures, there's often a very direct Punan connection right at the very start, at the root of it.
It seems that way in this documented case, yes. And it's not just an isolated example.
What other evidence links Klirieng specifically to the Punan?
Well, the sources mention several other Klirieng found in that broader Balaga region are associated directly with Punan aristocrats. Important historical figures like Kulan, his son Lhasa Kulan, and their ancestors.
Lhasa Kulan. That name sounds familiar.
He was quite prominent. He's the Punan leader who hosted the European explorer Robert Burns back in 1848. They apparently became sworn brothers.
Right, and Burns actually wrote about him, didn't he? Called him the ruler of the middle districts, the chief of Bintulu. That's a significant historical figure with clear authority.
Absolutely. And Lhasa Kulan's own Klirieng was erected at a place called Data Menamon. And here's the key point the sources make. These structures, these Klirieng, associated with Punan leaders.
They aren't just random posts.
Exactly. They are not random or generic funerary posts. They're deeply anchored in kinship, land tenure, and ritual authority. These are hallmarks of aristocratic Punan leadership and their social system.
Deeply integrated into Punan society and worldview.
That's the argument, yes.
Okay, let's try and weave this into the broader historical picture. The sources also talk about a specific Sekapan double Klirieng for figures named Blanget and Matu. It was documented way back in 1882, and amazingly, the story is preserved in the oral traditions of both the Sekapan and the Punan. How does that fit with Punan origins?
This is where understanding migrations and group interactions over time becomes really crucial. According to our sources, several prominent scholars, Leach, Nicolason, Guerrero, have perhaps tended to understate something important.
Which is?
The long-established Punan presence in that Balaga region, a presence that existed long before the Kayan people expanded into the area and really disrupted the whole upstream-downstream power balance. Rousseau estimates those Kayan incursions might have started back in the 18th century.
So the narrative isn't simply Kayan dominance. The Punan were already well established there, perhaps even earlier, and that's sometimes overlooked.
That seems to be the point the sources are making. And groups like the Sekapan, Kejaman, and Lahanan, their own oral histories consistently place their ancestral origins not in the Belui Basin where they ended up.
But somewhere else.
Yeah, further upstream, in the headwaters of the Kajan, Paran, and Kapur rivers. They were effectively displaced by this Kayan territorial expansion and had to migrate downstream.
And that migration brought them into closer contact with the Punan communities already there.
Precisely. A geographic shift leading to cultural proximity.
And what emerged from that proximity?
It seems that it was during this period, this time of closer contact and adaptation, that the double Klirieng, also called Klirieng Giban, likely emerged. Probably as a kind of visual and ritual modification or adaptation.
A modification? How so?
Well, this is significant. Unlike the traditional Punan Klirieng, which the sources say was carved from a single, massive, unbroken log, these double Klirieng had a composite structure. Two posts, often linked. It possibly signaled both convergence, coming together, and differentiation, showing there were still distinct groups adapting a practice.
So it shows a blend, maybe, but with the Punan tradition as the recognizable foundation being adapted.
That appears to be the interpretation offered, yes.
And the Punan themselves, they didn't just disappear from Balaga after these other groups arrived, did they?
No, not at all. The sources are quite clear that the Punan only really began to withdraw from those Balaga heartlands much later, in the 1930s. And that followed a major peacemaking ceremony, the Kapit Conference of 1924, which was a real watershed moment.
So their withdrawal was a specific historical event, a response to things changing.
Exactly. A Historically situated response to shifting governance structures like brook rule consolidating and ecological pressures, perhaps changes in resources. It wasn't a sign that their culture vanished or that they lost connection to these traditions rooted in the area.
Okay, this historical context is vital. It brings us back to those really strong claims. Azif apparently makes cultural appropriation and even plagiarism. Let's tackle appropriation first. If Punan communities today assert their ownership, their connection to the Klirieng, is that really cultural appropriation?
The sources argue pretty forcefully that, logically, it just can't be. Aziz's claim here is described as fundamentally flawed. Why? Because cultural appropriation is when elements of a culture are taken by outsiders.
Right, usually without understanding, permission, or giving credit.
Precisely. So a community, by definition, cannot appropriate its own cultural heritage. That doesn't make sense.
So if anything, the concern might be the other way around.
That's exactly what the sources suggest, that the more worrying dynamic here is the inverse.
Yeah.
The appropriation from the Punan via an attempt to reframe Klirieng as generic, interchangeable, and universally shared.
Which effectively dilutes or erases that specific origin story we've been discussing.
Yes, it risks obscuring rather than clarifying the history.
Okay, now what about that plagiarism claim? Suggesting that Punan asserting origins is like plagiarism. That sounds like a really serious charge.
It is a very serious word to use, but again, the research argues this is basically turning the concept inside out. Plagiarism is when you claim credit for someone else's work or creation.
Okay.
So if the Punan were indeed the cultural innovators of the Klirieng tradition, and the sources argue the ethnographic, historical, and oral records strongly point that way, then asserting that origin isn't plagiarism.
It's rightful authorship.
Right. It's claiming credit for what is theirs. So the real ethical question the sources pose is whether denying that origin actually constitutes a form of cultural myth attribution.
Or, as the sources put it quite powerfully, epistemic theft. That's a strong phrase. What does that mean in this context?
Epistemic theft.
Yeah.
It's about knowledge, right? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So epistemic theft is essentially denying a community, particularly an indigenous community, their rightful place as the creators, the innovators, the guardians of their own knowledge systems and traditions.
It's like stealing the credit for their intellectual and cultural work.
That's a good way to put it. It highlights the potential harm of misattribution, of erasing that specific origin and connection.
This all seems to circle back to what the sources called the problem with romantic generalization. Azif suggests Klirieng is equally shared. But what actual evidence does he provide for that specific claim?
Well, according to the research we're drawing on, Azif actually offers no substantive evidence for the claim that Klirieng is equally shared across multiple groups.
No evidence is presented, at least in the material being critiqued.
Correct.
And what's the contrast? What kind of evidence exists on the other side supporting the Punan connection?
In stark contrast, the sources point to decades, even over a century, of sustained documentation of Klirieng as a distinctly Punan institution. It's described as deeply embedded in their ritual life, their kinship structures, their hierarchies, even their territorial memory.
And this documentation comes from
All through the ethnographic record. From early researchers, people like Hose and McDougall back in the late 19th century, right through to more recent 20th century scholars like Nicolason and Rousseau.
So a consistent thread across anthropological work.
Yes, and the point is made repeatedly. These aren't just, interesting carved logs. They are mnemonic, funerary, and cosmological artifacts grounded in Punan social thought. They hold meaning, memory, and cosmology.
It really does sound like that appeal to inclusivity, while well-intentioned perhaps, can sometimes act as a kind of smokescreen in these discussions.
That's certainly the argument presented in the sources, that while it might sound progressive or equitable, in practice, this kind of generalization can obscure rather than clarify. It can inadvertently lead to erasing cultural specificity under the guise of equity.
And the sources suggest there's a sort of uncomfortable historical echo here, too.
Yes. They draw a parallel, suggesting Azif's line of argument resonates, perhaps unintentionally, with older colonial logics that viewed indigenous cultures as sort of common property.
Something available for anyone to extract, translate, repackage.
Kind of. It points to maybe a modern discomfort with cultural particularity, a preference for neat, generalized categories rather than grappling with the specific, unique histories and contexts of different indigenous knowledge systems.
So the takeaway isn't that sharing doesn't happen, but that acknowledging specific origins is vital.
Exactly. The sources conclude this section by saying that acknowledging Klirieng has specific Punan origins doesn't actually endanger that rich tapestry of Bornean cultures. If anything, it enriches it.
But what it does challenge...
What it does challenge, they argue, is that long-standing academic habit of treating indigenous knowledge as interchangeable folklore rather than as rigorous, place-based, and intellectually coherent systems.
Okay, so bringing this all together, for us, for you listening, what's the really crucial insight here?
I think the absolute core takeaway is that we have to differentiate between cultural sharing and cultural origins. It's fundamental if we want to genuinely respect indigenous heritage. It's about, well, giving credit where credit is due, understanding the unique cultural soil from which these complex traditions grow.
And the challenge is put quite directly in the sources. If there is credible evidence that Klirieng originated somewhere else entirely, or that it genuinely holds equivalent depth and meaning across many different groups,
then let's see it. Let that evidence be presented clearly and be scrutinized properly by everyone involved, especially the communities themselves.
But in the absence of that kind of robust evidence...
Then arguments against cultural specificity, arguments that push for this sort of generic sharedness, they risk doing real harm. They risk perpetuating the very kinds of, well, epistemic erasure, that knowledge theft we talked about, that a truly deep and respectful engagement with diverse cultures should be actively working to undo.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? How do we value knowledge? How do we attribute it? Especially when it comes from communities whose voices and histories have maybe been overlooked or simplified for far too long.
A crucial question indeed.